You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week we have a special episode. Our live roundtable had a discussion earlier this month where we covered the tea hysteria in America following the Boston Tea Party, and we also talked about the New Hampshire attack on Fort William and Mary in December of 1774. Our roundtable discussions are recorded live on Zoom. All participants are free to ask questions. In this case, some of these questions were asked in the comments section, which means I had to read and respond to them, so you won't hear the questions being asked. However, towards the end of the evening, people did ask their questions in active discussion, so you'll hear the question and the answer. If you would like to join our discussions live, please make sure to put your email address in my mailing list. I will send you an advance notice of our next Zoom meeting. And here begins our discussion of the tea hysteria of 1774 and the attack on Fort William and Mary.
So today we're going to discuss actually two topics because I wasn't sure I could fill up a full hour with just one. And they're both interesting topics from 1774. I've been picking a lot of our topics based on the 250th anniversary of things. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the anti-tea hysteria of 1774. And time permitting, we're going to talk a little about the British raid on Portsmouth, which happened in December of 1774. Actually, the 250th anniversary of that event, I think, is the 14th of December. So 3 days from now, we'll be hitting the 250th anniversary of those events. So I just thought it would be a timely thing to discuss, at least as far as historical events can be timely to discuss. So the anti-tea hysteria of 1774. I'm sure we're all aware of the Boston Tea Party and its role in the beginning of the Revolutionary War, but I just wanted to go back and give some background on why tea became such a flashpoint and why tea was still a very relevant and controversial issue even after the Boston Tea Party took place. So tea, why is tea such a big deal? Why did it become an important issue? For Britain, we always think of British people as loving tea, and that probably went back forever. It really didn't, especially when you're talking about colonial times. The first tea only began to arrive in Britain from China in the 1660s. There really wasn't any tea drinking in Britain or much of anywhere else before that. The Dutch had been bringing tea to Europe for a few decades before that, but it really hadn't caught on in a big way anywhere, and certainly not in Britain. We see some ads from the 1650s about some people talking about this new thing called tea, and isn't it interesting? And you got to try it. That was Dutch tea that was brought into Britain, but the East India Company didn't bring its first tea until the mid-1660s. There's some dispute on when the first load of tea actually arrived, but it was sometime in that area. Tea did obviously catch on very fast and became quite popular among not only the elites, but also more middle-class people, such as they were in England at the time. Over the next few decades, tea became extremely popular, and by the period just before the American Revolution, the colonial period, tea was a major economic influence in the British Empire. The East India Company was granted a monopoly on tea imports, so it was the only company that was permitted to import tea into the British Empire. There was a second tea company, as I alluded to before, the Dutch East India Company, which was run out of the Netherlands, and they have monopoly. But it was illegal for British subjects to import Dutch tea. Their only source was supposed to be the British East India Company tea. Of course, we know there was a lot of smuggling, and we'll get into the reasons for that later. But this was a big thing, and it wasn't just for the colonies. I mean, people in Britain itself were restricted to East India Company tea as well. And the East India Company, as a monopoly, was very highly regulated by the government. By the 1760s, tea was a huge thing. As I said, it was about 90% of the East India Company's imports. There were rules that all Chinese tea had to be brought to London before it could be shipped anywhere else in the empire. So you couldn't just take a ship to China and then bring the tea to the Americas or India or anywhere else. It had to come to London, where it would be taken off the ship. It would be taxed and go through a series of fees. And then if some other part of the empire wanted the tea, it would go back aboard another ship and shipped off. So this, of course, allowed the British to impose very heavy taxes and fees on the tea before it was even going out to the colonies. The colonies didn't actually pay any taxes on the tea. The tax was all paid in London by officials who were receiving it there. But of course, that greatly added to the price of the tea that the colonists were eventually paying. The taxes were more than 100% of the cost of tea. So if you drank a cup of tea, maybe 60% of what you were paying for was government taxes and fees, and the other 40% was the actual tea leaves and the cost of the company bringing it to you. Despite all these taxes and despite all this regulation, it was a hugely profitable product for the East India Company, which in turn became one of the most profitable ventures that funded the British government itself through all these taxes and fees. A very large percentage of the British budget came from East India Company fees, primarily on tea. So this was a really big deal. So why did tea become an issue in the colonies? As we all know, there was an attempt to tax the colonies in 1764, 1765, the most controversial of which was the Stamp Act. The colonies went nuts over that because they had never really been taxed before in any direct way. They put in place a lot of boycotts, and the Stamp Act was quickly repealed. Now, the big argument for the colonies then was Parliament can't tax us, it's taxation without representation. Part of the problem with that argument was that there had been import duties on colonial products for many years. The most commonly known one is the Molasses Act, which had been in place since the 1730s and was a considerable tax on molasses being brought up from the West Indies. Part of the problem with that is that it was not really well enforced. Most smugglers got around it, so there was almost no revenue collected on it. But it had been on the books for decades and no one complained about it. So how can the colonists suddenly complain in 1764 or 65 that they're having to pay these new duties on something that is, patently unconstitutional when they've been paying this tariff for years and years and years? So there became an argument that tariffs were okay, but direct taxes were not. And the Parliament looked at that and said, okay, you don't want direct taxes, but you're okay with tariffs. We'll pass the Townshend Acts and essentially put a whole bunch of duties on a whole bunch of imports, and we'll collect our money that way. The Americans had to come up with a good legal way to argue that this was wrong as well. The main argument that they came up with, which was put forward, I think, at first by John Dickinson, was that a tariff to regulate trade was a legitimate power of Parliament, but a tariff simply to raise revenue was not. Parliament, of course, said, we have the power to tax the colonies any way we like. And even after they repealed the Stamp Act, they passed another act which essentially said Parliament has the right to tax the colonies by any means they want. We're just not going to because we're nice guys and we're not going to do anything about it right now. So this set up a conflict between Parliament and the colonies over Parliament's power to tax and how far it extended, if it was limited at all, if there were limits, what exactly were those limits? And no one was quite sure how all this was going to play out. The Townshend Acts were subject to, again, colonial boycotts. It collected almost no money. In fact, the cost of enforcing it was a greater cost to Britain than the funds that were raised through the collection of any tariffs. In the end, Parliament repealed those tariffs again as well, except for the tariff on tea. And they left that in place, well, for two reasons. One, it was the only one that really collected any substantial amount of money. The others brought in next to nothing. And even the small amount that the tea tax collected, as I said, was not enough to pay for the enforcement, but it was at least a more significant amount. So the fight really came down to tea at that point. And we're talking about 1768 or 9 at this point, I think. And so for the next few years, there really wasn't a whole lot of attempts to change the situation on either side in any major way. The Americans were boycotting tea. They didn't want it to be imported. If some got in, they might give a hard time to the importer, But it wasn't a huge issue. There wasn't a lot of English tea being imported. Most of the tea that people were drinking at the time was smuggled Dutch tea because of the boycott on English tea. The British weren't really pushing the issue. And so for years, the issue just kind of sat there with nobody really sure where it was going to go next. Now we're going to fast forward to 1773. The East India Company goes through what I can only describe as a financial disaster. And it's primarily the result of a famine in Bengal, where they have a lot of investments. This area went through a huge famine. Millions of people died. There were no crops growing. And more importantly, probably to the men in London, the East India Company was losing profits. As I said, the East India Company was a huge part of the British government's budget. And probably more important than that to most members of Parliament is that most members of Parliament were major stockholders in the East India Company. And when the East India Company got into trouble, it stopped paying a very large dividend. And many members of Parliament were actually living on that dividend from year to year. And so to be suddenly cut off very much got their attention. They passed legislation which essentially almost nationalized the East India Company, gave the British government a lot more control over the company. And to help the company get out of trouble, the company had a huge amount of tea that was stockpiled in London that they just weren't selling. Parliament passed the Tea Act of 1773, which greatly changed the way tea would be taxed. It greatly reduced the overall price of tea. As I said, more than 100% of the cost of tea had been subject to tax before all these changes. So the changes they made essentially cut by more than half the price of tea. This was going to help the company sell all this extra tea and get them back to profitability. The act also allowed the East India Company to ship tea directly from China to other colonies. It didn't all have to come through London. So this was going to make it a lot cheaper to transit the stuff because the cost of bringing the ship to London, removing all the tea, then putting it back on a ship and sending it off to where it's going to just added to the costs of transmitting it. The British thought this was a great thing. Everybody's going to get way cheaper tea than they ever had before. Taxes were down, but Parliament did maintain a relatively small tax on tea that was being shipped to America. And unlike other taxes, this tax would be collected from the colonists when it arrived. Now, if they just wanted the money, Parliament very easily could have said the East India Company must pay this tax on this before it actually ships to the colonies. But they didn't do that. They wanted the colonists to pay the tax because they wanted to set the precedent that colonies would pay import duties that were imposed by Parliament. Once they set that precedent, they could start adding other tariffs on a wide range of other things, increase them as much as they wanted, and the colonists wouldn't really have an intellectual leg to stand on because they'd already given in on the main point that Parliament had a right to impose such tariffs. And now they're just talking about the amount of those tariffs, which isn't a principled stand. That's just complaining about taxes. So that was the idea. For the colonists, when this change happened, it doesn't seem like they actually really paid a whole lot of attention to it. The folks, especially in Boston, Samuel Adams, people like that, were focused really on a lot of other things that the British government was doing at the time, trying to basically make changes to government powers so that the next time there was a major dispute, Britain would have a much stronger hand to play against the colonists than they did under the current system. So they were paying attention to things like whether the colony or the British government was paying for judges and sheriffs in the colonies. If the colonies were paying for it and there was a crisis, they obviously had a great deal more influence over those officials than if London was making those payments. So things like that is what they were arguing over. And they really weren't paying much attention to the Tea Act. It was actually some tea importers in New York that really kind of put this issue on everyone's radar and said, no, we really do have to be concerned about this. Some of the more cynical arguments I've read is that the reason they did this is because the people who were paying attention to this were smugglers who were bringing in a great deal of Dutch tea, and they didn't want the competition of cheap English tea competing with their product. And there probably was some of that, but cynics will argue that that's the sole reason that people got upset about tea, and that certainly is not the case. Once the issue was raised, I think a lot of people like Samuel Adams and others saw that yes, the British were trying to slip something by them. They were, by offering very cheap tea with an almost nominal tax on it, convincing consumers to buy it because it was just so much cheaper than they'd ever seen it before, and paying that tariff, and then having basically conceded the point that whether Parliament could do this or not. So it became, a much bigger issue. And Britain, of course, had set up the Tea Act so that they thought they could push it through. Basically, what they did is they had agents in all of the colonies who would be recipients of tea, and the agent would pay the tax when it was imported, and then they would go and sell the tea to others. So they didn't have to convince the whole colony that it was okay to pay the tax. They just basically had to convince one person in each colony to take this very financially lucrative position. And then it's up to him to deal with any complaints or concerns that other people have about paying the tariff. So the British were pretty confident that the tax would be paid by these people who were receiving the tea. And what happened after that, they weren't terribly concerned about. When the colonists really took notice of what was going on, mobs essentially went around to all of the tea agents and said, you really don't want this. You better resign from this position. Otherwise, your property's probably going to have a lot of accidents and you may find yourself wearing tar and feathers and things like that. And so they were trying to convince a lot of people to just get out of it. Now, in 1773, after the Tea Act was passed, the East India Company sent 4 shipments of tea to the Americas. Actually, there was on, I think, about 7 or 8 ships altogether, but they were going to 4 cities: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. In each case, local patriots had organized to ensure that the tea would be refused. When the tea reached Philadelphia and New York, local patriots were able to get the ship turned around before it entered port, convinced the agent and the ship's captain that this was a really bad idea and that they shouldn't try it, and the ships just turned around and left. In Charleston, the tea was actually landed, but local officials impounded the tea, put it in a warehouse, and it was never sold to anyone. And I don't think the tax was ever paid on it either. In Boston, of course, it became a much bigger problem because the royal governor there, Thomas Hutchinson, wanted to make this work. And so when the ships first arrived, he essentially said, you can't leave until the tax is paid. The local mobs under Samuel Adams essentially said, there's no way this tax is going to be paid. There was a rule that if the ship was in dock for 20 days and did not pay the taxes, that the tea would be impounded and then sold, and the taxes would be collected from that sale. So Hutchinson thought he had them. There was no way out of this. Of course, they proved him wrong by the luck of a great number of Mohawk Indians showing up the night before the ship's tea was going to be impounded and throwing the tea into the harbor. So that's, of course, the Boston Tea Party that we're all familiar with. That became a huge issue on both sides. Of course, the British were upset. They actually considered this what we would probably consider an act of vandalism. They considered an act of treason, and they wanted to be very serious about coming after this. This was one of a long line of incidents that happened in the colonies, primarily in Boston, showing disregard for British rule of law. And, of course, they made an issue of it through the coercive acts, later called the Intolerable Acts, which set the whole continent on the road to war the following year. But I'm not going to get into all that tonight. I just wanted to say what the American reaction was to all of this. What did the Americans do after the Boston Tea Party? For starters, it was not the only tea party to take place. As I said, tea was sent away from New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston, but any tea that tried to enter the colonies after that point was rejected. At the end of December, only a couple weeks after the Boston Tea Party, there was some more tea that entered the colony. There were actually 4 tea ships that had gone to Boston. 3 of them entered Boston Harbor. The 4th one shipwrecked off Cape Cod. That 4th ship had some tea chests on it that were eventually unloaded and sold. A local merchant in Provincetown was caught by patriots with several chests of tea from this 4th ship, and that tea was seized and burned. But you have acts like this all over the continent. It's not just Massachusetts. Students in Princeton broke into their university stores and found several pounds of tea that were being stored there, and that was taken out and ceremonially burned. There was a whole range of protests like this where mobs would find tea and either dump it into the water or burn it. There was one in Chestertown, Maryland. There was one in Wilmington, North Carolina. In September, there was one in York and what is today Maine that was also seized. There was some tea in Annapolis, Maryland. The one in Annapolis, it's actually interesting that the captain tried to smuggle the tea in on a ship. The local patriots forced the ship back into the harbor. Then they set the ship on fire, burning the entire ship along with its cargo of tea. So that was a particularly harsh one for the would-be smuggler. There was tea burned in Yorktown, Virginia. Another merchant who was trying to get tea into Philadelphia. It was common to try to smuggle tea into a large port, often by landing somewhere nearby and then moving the tea inward. So in this case, they landed in Greenwich, New Jersey. They planned to bring the tea overland to Philadelphia, but locals in Greenwich learned about the tea and, of course, seized it and burned it. So this was happening all over the place. It was not an uncommon thing. Somebody asked if this would be considered an act of terrorism. Somebody already noted terrorism was not really a word at the time, but to the extent we're talking about using violence and threats of violence to achieve a political end, I guess you could consider this to be a terrorist act. Certainly, the merchants and agents who wanted to participate in the tea trade were being terrorized by mobs of people who did not agree with it. I know terrorism is a loaded word. I'm not saying that what they were doing was necessarily a bad thing. We tend to associate the word terrorism today with, things like the murder of innocent civilians and things like that, and the wanton murder. Things were not going that far. This was some violence and a lot of intimidation, just mostly violence in the form of destruction of property. When there was physical violence against a person, it was tended more to shame them than to actually hurt them. Tar and feathering was a very common way of shaming people who were cooperating in this process. And that was not something that would be deadly. It was more of a humiliation than anything. So anyway, we have all this tea hysteria going on. And it wasn't just imports that were being blocked. I mean, if there was tea possessed anywhere by anyone, it could be tea that a merchant had held long before the boycott started. It could be smuggled tea. It could be Dutch tea. It could be anything. The mere possession of tea, the sale of tea, the drinking of tea was considered almost a traitorous cause. And when I talk about anti-tea hysteria, I'm not just talking about political protest. I'm talking about newspaper articles that were talking about, tea being a noxious weed, that it was horribly unhealthy, that it was a danger to society. There were articles that talked about tea bringing fleas into America, which were causing disease, talking about how Chinese women created the tea bricks by stomping on them with their dirty bare feet, and just all sorts of articles that really had nothing to do with the main issue at hand, but just a way of really discouraging anyone from wanting to drink tea. I kind of compare it to the 20th century reefer madness, the almost irrational fear of marijuana that was going on for a long time. It was kind of almost the same irrational fear that we were seeing about tea. He says, sounds like today's war on drugs. In a way, it was. So, yeah, it was. There was this whole movement against any type of tea, not importing it, not drinking it, not buying or selling it. So tea, which had been an extremely popular and common drink in the colonies, almost disappeared completely during the pre-war era and during the war itself. It was replaced with a number of things. There were a lot of herbal teas that came on the market that were made from locally sourced plants. Coffee became much more common. Coffee was drunk, very much in the British Empire, including the colonies, before the war. But obviously, with tea off the table, coffee became more popular. Hot chocolate was actually also a very common drink at the time, and also became more common as the result of tea falling off the market. Somebody asks about American smugglers. As I said, there were many attempts to smuggle tea into the colonies. A great many of them were caught and the tea destroyed. Obviously, we don't have records of the ones that secretly did make it in and were able to sell the tea. There probably were some smugglers who did benefit from the process. As always, there's always people who want to get something that nobody else is allowed to have and are willing to pay for it. And if there's someone willing to pay for it, there's someone willing to deliver it. So I imagine there was some smuggling. I Would like to note, though, as I said at the beginning, a lot of cynics said that the protest over tea was started by Dutch smugglers of tea into the British colonies, and that's the real reason behind it. Obviously, whatever their motives were, it was not the motives of most people, because the smuggling of tea and the drinking of Dutch tea was just as much condemned as anything else. So it really ended the entire tea market in the colonies. During the war itself, I think the concern about drinking tea became less and less of an issue, because by the time the United States were independent, any tea that people were bringing in wasn't going to be helping the British government in any way. But tea drinking really did not come back in a big way until after the war. And at that point, there were American merchant ships that went around the coast of South America and across the Pacific and actually picked up their own tea to bring back to the United States and sell. By that time, it was perfectly acceptable. The political issue that had surrounded tea during the colonial era was over, and people were happy to start buying tea again. You mentioned John Hancock as one of the American smugglers. Smuggling was a very, very common thing among almost all colonial merchants. And a big part of it was because there were so many rules that the colonists regarded as illegitimate or just impossible to comply with, that made a lot of importing simply, it was impossible to make a profit. So there were a great many people who smuggled a whole range of things. And a lot of it wasn't even over taxes. The British system at the time prevented any sort of commerce between British colonies and non-British colonies. So there was a lot of commerce that was going on with colonies in the West Indies, where various colonies that were held by the French or the Spanish or the Dutch, and any trade with those colonies was per se smuggling, but it happened and it was very common. John Hancock was a merchant and he was a smuggler. A very well-known example of that is the Liberty riots of, I'm going to forget when they are now, I think 1768, where John Hancock brought one of the ships he owned, was named the ship of the name was Liberty, came into Boston Harbor. Customs collector tried to board the ship and see what taxable items were aboard. The ship's captain locked the customs official below decks and then had his men unload the ship so the customs official couldn't see what was going on, and essentially smuggled those goods into Boston right under the customs collector's nose, or over his head in this case, since he was locked below decks. Of course, a few months later, when a British naval ship arrived and the customs official reported all this, the British seized the ship Liberty and indicted Hancock for smuggling. That set off a series of riots in the town of Boston. It forced the customs officials to flee the city. They had to go live on an island out in Boston Harbor for their own protection. A great deal of property was damaged. One of the customs officials owned a small boat that was dragged into the center of town and set on fire. The British eventually released, or I guess they never actually took Hancock into custody, but they ended the indictment against him and didn't go forward with charges against him. But they did keep the ship, the Liberty, as a confiscated property, and it was actually put into service as a customs enforcement vessel, and ended up doing enforcement work down near Rhode Island. And local Rhode Island patriots eventually boarded the ship and burned it down to the waterline and destroyed it because they didn't like the customs officials there. So there was a lot of smuggling. The finest families in the colonies who were engaged in the merchant trade were smuggling. It didn't hold any sort of, it wasn't considered condemnable by the people in the colonies. Obviously, there were a lot of British officials who didn't approve of it, but it was not socially or culturally a problem at the time for a lot of people. Somebody asked about the Dutch East India Company able to sell tea freely to the Americas after the Treaty of Paris. The Americans were open to free trade, so anybody who wanted to trade with the Americans were welcome to do so, and that includes the Dutch East India Company. Ironically, the one thing that Americans couldn't trade with was other British colonies, because the British, at least initially, were trying to punish the Americans for leaving the British Empire, and so all trade with British colonies, especially in the West Indies, was cut off. But yeah, the Americans actively tried to trade with other countries and set up trade agreements with the Dutch, with the French, with the Spanish. In a lot of cases, they ran into trouble because all those countries had restrictions on trading outside their own respective empires as well. Now, the Dutch were an exception to that. They tend to be more on the free trade side, I guess, because they didn't have a huge empire of their own. So yeah, they were pretty willing to trade with the Americans. But as I said, the Americans developed their own very large and aggressive merchant fleet in the early years of independence after the war, and they were doing a lot of international trade on their own. They were going directly to China. They weren't counting on third parties to bring things to them. They were going to go out and get it. And that became very common very quickly. A couple of the quick notes, which happened after the war, but help you give a picture of how different things were during the war. A lot of people think of tea coming from India. That was not the case in the 18th century. There was zero tea grown in India. All tea came from China. The British began growing tea in India, I believe in the 1830s, 1820s or 30s, and that made tea a lot easier to provide to the rest of the empire. And eventually, British trade with America opened back up, and British tea began flowing as well after the British got over their snit about losing the colonies in the first place. So yeah, tea became a much more common drink and became much easier, cheaper, and popular once tea was being grown in India in the 1820s and 30s. I should also note that the British became upset over time by the fact that they were giving so much hard currency to China every year to get tea that they were trying to come up with products that they could trade to China to keep more of their hard currency at home. And the biggest trading thing that they came up with was opium. And they began growing a lot of opium in India. This was being grown even during the Revolutionary War era. It became a much, much larger project in the 1820s and 30s. And they began trading opium to China for tea. And they traded opium all over the world. Opium became a major export for them. China in the 1820s and 30s saw the impact of opium was having on their population, the drug use and the problems it was causing. And they actually outlawed the use of opium and the imports of opium. And regardless of the drug laws, Britain continued to import opium into China and to use it as a trade item. And they actually went to war with Chinese officials on several occasions. These are the opium wars of the early to mid 1800s to force China to continue to accept their opium. So if you want to look for the first major international drug cartel, I think it has to be Great Britain. But anyway, so that's kind of the history of tea. Well, I'm going to touch on, as I said, I wanted to touch on one other issue tonight, and that's the Portsmouth alarm, which is an incident that took place in December of 1774. So 250th anniversary of the event is happening later this week. So I thought it would be a fun thing to talk about tonight. Portsmouth, New Hampshire was obviously everybody in the colonies was predicting that civil war, or war with Britain, was going to break into open warfare in the spring. There were a whole lot of things that happened in late 1774, including they received the coercive acts from Britain, which everybody was very upset about. They held the First Continental Congress in the fall of 1774. There was massive protests, especially in Massachusetts, over changes to their colonial charter, which essentially took away the rights of self-government, the right to hold town meetings, things like that. There was virtually all-out warfare. The only thing that hadn't happened was actual shedding of blood yet. But Massachusetts militia had turned out against British officials on several occasions. The British government had essentially fled to Boston and was not in control of the rest of the colony. Everybody was expecting there would be large numbers of British reinforcements in the spring, and the spring is the time when countries began new war campaigns, and so everybody was kind of expecting that to happen in the spring of 1775. So over the winter of 1774 and 75, both sides were kind of jockeying for position. As I said, General Gage had given up on trying to actually control Massachusetts outside of the city of Boston. He had been under orders to go in and really take charge and be the tough guy in Massachusetts when he took over in the summer of 1774. It did not work out well for him. Militia were really turning out against him, muskets in hand, ready to fight, and he realized he didn't have nearly enough men to go up against this large group, which is why he retreated into Boston and immediately started sending lots of panicked letters to London saying, send us reinforcements, as many as you possibly can. He asked for as many as 20,000 troops. And this is at a time when the entire army throughout the entire British Empire numbered around 50,000 soldiers. So sending 20,000 to Boston would have been an amazingly large thing. He didn't get that many. They obviously would send that many the following year when after war had really taken off. But in any event, there was this jockeying for position. And one thing that Gage thought he could do over the winter was seize arms and ammunition from the colonists wherever he could. There were a lot of, obviously all colonists held muskets. He did not attempt to seize privately owned muskets, although at one point, colonists tried to ride out of Boston with a wagon full of 10,000 rounds of ammunition. And when the guards asked him what it was for, he said personal use. They didn't believe him and they confiscated those. But by and large, they didn't confiscate personal small arms. But there were many privately owned cannons, privately owned howitzers, fairly large weapons. Many of these were owned by ship's captains who kept them on their ships for fighting pirates. There were also some towns that local militias owned a cannon or two as part of their militia regiment. So Gage was trying to seize as many of these, and he also wanted to seize gunpowder. The imports of gunpowder and arms and ammunition from Britain was banned by the Privy Council, I think in September of 1774. They were obviously trying to cut off what they saw was going to be their enemy in a few months from arming themselves. Gage sent out several parties of regulars to seize powder. He did so at a powder silo in Charleston, Massachusetts. When he did that, there was actually a rumor that regulars had shot local militia that were trying to stop them, and that several men were killed. When that rumor spread, 30,000 militia turned out and started descending on Boston. Now, most of them turned around and went home when they realized the story wasn't true. But about 5,000 men did actually make it to Charlestown, and they hung around for a while demanding answers. And it was actually the lieutenant governor turned out to speak with them alongside Joseph Warren, who was one of the head patriots at the time. And both of them talked to the men and basically convinced them that, no, these rumors weren't true. Nothing happened. You can all go home. They did stick around long enough to force a few men to resign from the governor's council, including the lieutenant governor, who was forced to resign under duress. But the incident raised a bunch of issues for a lot of people, and more specifically for the Patriots. They realized that they didn't have an early warning system, that the British were able to get out, seize the powder, and get back to Boston before any of the militia were roused to respond. So Joseph Warren and others started developing an early warning system so that when they did hear rumors about a British movement, that they could get the word out very quickly and that people could respond very quickly. And Warren turned to a local silversmith named Paul Revere to head up this process, which he did. A lot of people think of Paul Revere as just, going out on the night before Lexington and shouting to people that the British are coming. And that's really not the case. Revere was involved in a very thoughtful, well-planned system where he would identify key people in every township and every area that he would know to go to provide the warning to them, and then those people could warn others in the area. So there was kind of like a phone tree where he would warn one person and they would warn three others and they would warn three others, so that they could gather the militia together very quickly. They also adopted the Minuteman plan around this time, so that certain members of the militia would literally be ready to act on a minute's notice. And these were guys that essentially kept their guns strapped to their back 24/7. So if they were out plowing in a field or going to church or wherever, they had their gun with them. And if they got word, they were ready to go. Of course, that came in much handy in the spring when there were additional raids on places like Concord. Somebody asks, gun laws were strict according to today's standards. There were actually very specific gun laws that existed in the colonies. Most of them had to do with mandating gun ownership. Most men between the ages of 16 and 60 were obligated to have a firearm. and a certain amount of ammunition in case there was a need to call out the militia. You were expected to be armed and ready to go. Something that I guess they had back then that we don't have so much now is that all these gun owners were required to attend regular drills so that they understood how to act as a group and how to use firearms properly, participate as if they were in an army, because that's what they would be called up to do in time of an emergency. But in terms of gun regulations, there really weren't any. As I said, there were private citizens who owned their own cannons and howitzers. There was not a lot of restrictions on guns. And General Gage, as I said, did not even attempt to take guns away from people that were potential troublemakers. Now, I don't think he had a principled reason for doing that as much as he had fear that if he tried to do it, that it would result in an immediate uprising against him. So there were attempts to take away guns or keep guns from certain people at certain times. There were a lot of cases in the early part of the war where patriots would disarm people they knew to be loyalists. And in loyalist strongholds, loyalists would often try to disarm patriots. Even before they'd done anything wrong, they just took the guns away from them because they knew there would be trouble. Of course, there were many groups that were not allowed to have guns at all. One of the most common was slaves. Slaves were not allowed to own firearms. They were not allowed to possess firearms. They were not allowed to know how to use firearms. Probably well understandable reasons. In some cases, free blacks were barred from owning firearms as well, although in Massachusetts, black people who were free were owners of firearms and were part of the militia. As I said, gun rules varied greatly from colony to colony. Pennsylvania, for example, did not have a militia at all. They eventually had, certain volunteers, so that was more during the war, but it was a state run by pacifists, so it was a lot less of an issue. So yeah, things were very different. But in any event, in the late fall, early winter of 1774, Gage is doing his best to take what he can away from the colonists, and the colonists were doing their best to arm themselves to the teeth because there was going to be a fight in the spring and everybody seemed to know it. So Gage became aware, I guess it went up on his radar, that there was a large amount of gunpowder and cannons at Fort William and Mary in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and he decided to send a few boatloads of Marines up there to secure those items. The Americans got word, the Patriots got word of this, Joseph Warren, and he asked Paul Revere to ride to Portsmouth to warn the local Patriots. So Paul Revere made his less famous ride to Portsmouth in December and rode up in a matter of a day or two and warned the locals that British Marines were most likely on their way to seize the cannon and gunpowder at Fort William and Mary. Fort William and Mary did have a garrison of regulars. The garrison consisted of a British captain and 5 soldiers. And all of these 5 soldiers were on invalid duty. When a soldier was incapable of doing a lot of hard marching and hard work that they were expected to do for a range of reasons, they were put on invalid duty, and they were used to garrison forts that were not considered terribly important. So this was one of them. So you had a total of 6 men defending this fort. When Revere went up and made contact with the local militia, they decided that they were going to go into the fort and seized what they regarded as colonial property and take it so that the British could not spirit it away. Governor Wentworth became aware of all this and tried to call out the militia to stop them. The problem turned out to be that all of the militia that were going to be called out to stop them were already busily engaged in actually getting ready to attack the fort themselves. They couldn't find any militiamen who were willing to defend the fort. They all wanted to attack the fort. So I find this event really comical because the country really wasn't at war yet. We're talking December 1774. A lot of the people were worried about committing an act of war against the British Army and being guilty of treason. So nobody really kind of wanted to admit that they wanted to do this, but they all did want to do it. And they ended up sending some people into the fort. I don't know why, that the commander of the fort allowed several people to come in and just talk with him. And eventually he had 9 people inside the fort that he didn't really know. They very probably could have overpowered the 6-man garrison when they were there, but he actually eventually forced them to leave. The men had gathered intelligence about the fort's defenses, though, and eventually they came over and stormed the fort. The 6-man garrison actually did fire on them. They fired cannons and fired a volley of muskets. For some reason, they used solid shot on the cannon instead of, grape shot or something. So they didn't hit anyone. The militia stormed the fort, entered the fort, demanded the keys to the powder room. Captain refused. They broke down the door. They took all the powder, carried it off inland where it couldn't be seized by the British. The governor was really outraged by all of this. He ended up trying to call out more distant militia to come secure the fort. One of the militiamen who showed up was a regimental colonel named John Sullivan. Some of you may know the name because he became a continental general the following year. At this point, Governor Wentworth thought he was a good British subject who would obey orders. As it turned out, Sullivan ended up going back and forth between the governor and the militia, trying to work out something without wanting to admit he was a traitor, but also not wanting to comply with the governor's edicts. In the end, he ended up leading a force of 1,600 men against the fort the following day. The commander of the fort at this point didn't even attempt to keep them out. There was no way him and his 5 invalid soldiers were going to put up any defense against 1,600 militiamen. They came into the fort, did a search for pretty much anything of value, muskets, powder, ammunition, anything that had been left behind. And they also took 16 cannons out of the fort. They left behind most of the cannons just because they were too big to carry off. They took the smaller ones that were field cannons and left the really big ones. So they trundled off into the woods and spent the next day carrying them as far away as they possibly could. A day or two later, the British Marines finally did arrive in their ships. They found the fort had been completely emptied, and so they basically turned around and went back to Boston. The governor did fire Sullivan from his position in the militia and several other leaders that he knew took place from various government positions, but everybody pretty much ignored him at that point. They weren't listening to the any kind of British officials anymore. And of course, the governor himself had to flee the colony within the next 6 months when the Americans really took over. So that was kind of the end of all of that. General Sullivan obviously went on to participate in the Second Continental Congress and was one of the first people commissioned as a Continental General. So that's kind of the story of Fort William and Mary. It was an interesting event that, was kind of an open warfare before anyone was willing to admit that there was a war. So that was all over by December 17th. Somebody asked what Parliament's response was to the capture of William and Mary. By the time word had gotten back, you're probably talking, this happened in December, so it probably wouldn't have been February or March until Parliament had heard about it. By that time, Parliament was on a full-scale war footing already. They had already sent large numbers of reinforcements to Boston. General Howe, General Clinton, and General Burgoyne were on their way with large numbers of troops to put down the rebellion in Massachusetts. And they assumed that once the rebellion in Massachusetts was put down, they would take care of the other New England rebels, including those in places like Rhode Island and New Hampshire that were also causing trouble. So it didn't cause a particular outrage because they were already used to the fact that the Americans in the colonies seemed to be in full rebellion. So I haven't read any specifics about any more outrage than that. The colonists were arguing that they were only taking their own property, that this was colonial property and that they were entitled to it. Obviously, the British thought differently, that this was the king's arms, and what they were doing was an act of outlawry and rebellion. Why was the fort built in the first place? When was it built? A lot of coastal towns had forts at the time, and this was one of them. It was mostly built many years earlier when there may have been threats from the French or other groups that might have attacked colonies, and it was built to be available if there needed to be some defense of the colony. As you might guess by the fact that there were only 6 men defending the fort, there was no immediate threat seen. There hadn't been for a very long time, but since the fort was there and had a lot of cannons and things in it, there had to be some small garrison just to maintain a nominal control. Somebody else mentions that there was seizure of arms and powders in other places like Rhode Island and London, Connecticut. That's true. There was also a fight over control of powder in Williamsburg, Virginia, around the same time. As I said, basically everybody thought they were going to war in the spring, and everybody was looking to secure arms and ammunition for the coming festivities, and that was part of it. Why did the governor trust Sullivan? He was a delegate to the First Continental Congress. Part of the reason for that was the First Continental Congress was not necessarily seen as treasonous. And there were, in fact, a lot of loyalists who attended the First Continental Congress. And a lot of loyalists wanted the First Continental Congress because it actually delayed a lot of states and patriot groups from initiating their own boycotts. It was seen as a way of slowing down the boycott movement. So attending the First Continental Congress did not necessarily mean you were a patriot. It mostly meant you were a colonial leader of some importance, someone that the people respected. Second Continental Congress, a lot of the loyalists avoided because by that time, the colonies were already at war since it began after Lexington and Concord. Even in the Second Continental Congress, there were a lot of people who were not ready for a complete break with Britain. Anybody else have anything they wanted to talk about or ask about?
Yeah, Mike. Hi, this is Bob Wong. I have a question for you, for clarification. You mentioned earlier that there's the famine in Bengal that apparently affected the tea trade or tea concerns. But you said then that most of the tea came from China and not from India. So
yeah, there were a lot of things that the East India Company did grow in India besides tea. The famine in Bengal did not affect the tea trade. It affected the profitability of the East India Company overall. It caused them to lose a lot of money. I'm not sure what the exact cost was to the company, but it was general loss of profitability overall. The East India Company also had more tea than they knew what to do with, so it wasn't like there was a lack of tea coming in. That's one reason why they heavily discounted the tea, because there was such a huge surplus in warehouses in London that the East India Company owned. So their loss of profitability was not the result of not having enough tea. It was a whole range of.
Thank you.
And I have to say the famine in Bengal was also a huge concern for the colonists. Their whole concern about taxation without representation was the idea that if Britain could tax you and you had no way to vote the bums out when they overtaxed you, that you would be taxed to the point of virtual starvation. And they saw this happening in places like Ireland and Bengal, where the people were basically living hand to mouth as all wealth was being extracted from those areas and given to very wealthy people in London. So that when hard times did hit, when there was a famine or when there was some other problem, there was no excess wealth to fall back on. And people literally starved and died by the millions, as they did in Bengal during this time. The Americans did not want to see that happen in America. And as I said, the taxes were very small and very nominal in the beginning, but they saw what Britain was doing in other parts of the world, and they could see that happening to them eventually down the road if they allowed these small beginnings to begin. So that's why they saw Bengal as a concern. But as far as the British were concerned, this was a big financial problem for the East India Company and a reason why the government needed to come in and reform the company and make some changes to make the company more profitable again. And it didn't have anything to do with tea. And in Bengal, it had to do with other products that were being grown in Bengal. Anything else?
Mike, I had a question. Governor Wentworth identified Paul Revere as being the person who provided the information. Why didn't Gage take any action against Revere?
Well, Gage knew who the leaders were in the Patriot movement, and Revere and Joseph Warren and others were living right under his nose in Boston. He could have picked them up anytime he wanted to, but he feared that picking them up would cause an immediate militia uprising and they would overrun the town before he received reinforcements, and that, he could end up with his entire army captured by these out-of-control colonists. So he was doing his best to kind of keep things calm until he received his reinforcements in the spring. That's what he was waiting for. And at that point, Revere probably would have been arrested, and Joseph Warren would have been arrested, and a whole bunch of other people would have been arrested. But they ended up getting out of Dodge after Lexington. I mean, Revere never went back to Boston after he rode out to warn the people in Lexington and Concord. If he had gone back at that point, he probably would have been arrested. So yeah, Gage knew who he was. He knew he was a troublesome figure, but he did not want to risk a premature uprising of the colony before he had the forces to deal with it.
Well, he might have been charged as being an accessory to larceny of the powder, in that sense, that he could have been arrested and charged as a criminal in that manner. I thought that would be the way to to deal with him if Gage wanted to.
Well, again, he was a patriot leader. He was engaged in what everybody else in the colony considered legitimate patriot activity. If he had been arrested, even as a common criminal, I don't think the people would have seen it that way. They would have risen up against him. Gage did try to arrest several people for relatively minor things, like holding unauthorized town meetings and stuff like that. He did that in Salem several months before this, and 1,000 militiamen showed up at the jail and demanded the freedom of these arrestees immediately. That told Gage he was really sitting on a dangerous hotbed, and he didn't want to throw too many sparks out and cause a larger explosion before he had the troops to deal with it.
Hey, Mike, the fort, I was just doing some research on it was built in 1632. It was built to defend the port of Portsmouth.
Yeah, I think the fort was started then when the colony started, and that's true of a lot of the early cities. They put up a wall with a cannon or two in front of it. It was built up into a larger fort over time, but yeah, it did originate quite early. You're right.
It's amazing.
Well, you got to remember when the British colonists first landed in New England, what became New England, they were very much afraid that they were going to be attacked by Spanish or French or Dutch ships that also had claims on these same lands. So anybody who had a colony wanted to have some level of defense against that colony, to protect that colony from foreign invaders. That was always an expectation and a concern.
Mike, I always thought that part of what set William and Mary apart was that it was an actual fort, whereas there were countless. I mean, I'm sure there actually is a count, but there was numerous incidents at powder magazines, and yet it's a little more complicated than those because frequently it was personal gunpowder that was stored there. It was the militia's gunpowder. And so there was really an argument to be made as to whose property, whose gunpowder that was. And yet all of a sudden the Crown forces are coming to collect it all, kind of a thing. So it's an interesting dynamic, I thought, in the whole evolution of how this plays out.
Yeah, there was a lot of dispute in a lot of places over whether the powder being held in the various powder rooms were privately owned, or whether they were the king's powder, or whether it was the colony. I mean, at one time, the colony and the king were the same thing, essentially. So now that they're being considered separate things, it's a question of what constitutes the king's powder and what constitutes colonial powder. And when you talk about private powder, you're right that there were many private individuals who owned significant amounts of gunpowder, and they kept them in these public rooms. The reason for that, of course, is that gunpowder tends to be somewhat explosive, and keeping it in a house where you have a lot of candles and fireplaces and things like that is generally not a good idea. So people who had significant amounts of gunpowder would keep their private stashes in these other places. So there were a lot of fights, but I think General Gage was I don't think he was terribly concerned if he was seizing someone's private powder or other powder. He wanted to keep gunpowder out of the hands of the colonists, who he saw as, being just about ready to rise up against him and start using that powder to shoot his soldiers. Yeah.
And particularly in Massachusetts, they had also foreseen this, so their provincial, or I forget what it was actually called then, the shadow legislature had basically, passed a law to tell everybody to pull their stuff out of it and not let it go to the Crown forces. So it was quite a lot of back and forth in anticipation of what they thought was coming, which proved to be correct.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, everybody knew it was coming, and they were all just kind of waiting and wait. Things moved at so much of a slower pace back then than they do today. And a lot of it had to do with the amount of time it took to communicate across the ocean and get reinforcements sent and all that sort of thing. But the Provincial Congress of Massachusetts formed shortly after Gage retreated into Boston in the, I guess it was late summer of 1774. And they pretty much controlled and governed the entire colony as an independent government, and they were very much getting ready for war against the British regulars. They were drilling their soldiers. I mean, as I said, militia usually turned out for a few hours drill 4 times a year. These militia were drilling, several times a week because they knew they were going to war in a matter of months, and they wanted to be really ready for it. And the provincial militia was all over that. I'm not sure about the details about whether the gunpowder held at Fort William and Mary, whether there might have been some private powder in there or whatever. But it really it came down to a matter of power. It came down to the matter of the Patriots in New Hampshire needed gunpowder to put up any sort of resistance, and the British regulars wanted to deny that to them. So whatever legal issues there may have been, I think this had to, as I said, they were pretty much already on a war footing, and both sides were going to war even though no bloodshed had been spilled yet.
Right.
Somebody's noting that the town of Newcastle, New Hampshire is having a 2-day event this weekend. Unfortunately, I will not be attending, but it sounds like a lot of fun. There's a lot of really cool 250th anniversaries coming up with events all over the country. I'm not sure I'll get to a whole lot up in New England. Maybe when they get down to the Philadelphia area, I'll start going to some of them. Would like to visit some of them, though. It should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I would have liked to have been in Boston last year for their 250th, even though I do think the Tea Party is somewhat overrated, but it still would have been fun, and it would be fun to go to Lexington and Concord this year. But I think it'll be a zoo.
Yeah, it probably will. Lexington and Concord's going to be great. So there's a whole lot of stuff obviously coming up when we get into 250th. See, Ed, when we get into the 250th anniversary of 1775, there's a whole bunch. You got Fort Ticonderoga. Whole bunch of things coming up. It should be an exciting time. I'm really looking for. Well, I usually try to keep this to an hour. We've already gone an hour, 20 minutes, so I don't want to hold you guys up forever. I think it's been a great event. As I said, next month, we're hopefully going to have a speaker talking about Saratoga. This is not a 250th or anything. It's just because I happen to get an author who's written about Saratoga and wants to come on and talk to us about it. So you won't have to listen to me drone on for the full hour. We'll actually have somebody else to talk to. And of course, I'll be ready with lots of questions for her. But it should be an interesting event. If anybody has any other things they want to talk about as subjects for next year, always feel free to let me know, drop me an email or whatever. We'll certainly consider it. I'm always looking for interesting topics. I've been kind of focusing a lot on 250th anniversaries of things as they come up, so I may do more of that. But I'm not afraid to go off calendar if we have an interesting topic that doesn't fit into a 250th anniversary. All right, guys. Thanks for stopping by, and hope to see you all next month. Have a wonderful Christmas, a Happy New Year, happy holidays, and see you all in the new year.
Thanks again to everyone who participated in our December 2024 roundtable discussion. I generally hold these events on the second Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you'd like to join our next roundtable live, please be sure to add your email address to my mailing list. I will provide you with advance notice of all future meetings. There should be a link to the mailing list in the show notes for this episode. Once again, thanks for joining. Please join us again next week for another American Revolution podcast.